Good afternoon, and today we're going to talk about, as you saw, what you wear matters. Now let's hear why. Everybody this week, I'm sure, noticed the spat that happened in the White House. And of course, we always love talking about politics here, but you'll ask some people, they'll say the reason why the spat happened is because Trump wanted him to come with a suit, and he came wearing his fatigue, his attire that he was wearing from war. Trump wanted to make peace, and therefore he wanted him to wear a suit. He wanted to show a continued war, so therefore he was still wearing his war uniform. As he said, I'm wearing this as long as the war is going on. Why would everybody making such a big deal what the guy's wearing? What does it make a difference what he's wearing, and so on? The question is, why does clothing take up such an important agenda in people's lives? If you look a little more, if you take a little survey and ask AI, ChatGPT, how much energy people put into clothing, and it's about the fifth item in a person's list of things that they spend money on. The amount of money that's spent in the world on clothing, on attire, is over $3 trillion. A person, when he looks at his expenses, they go, we'll start with home, food, education, and like the number 4 is clothing and what they're going to wear. People put a lot of effort into what they're going to wear or not wear, as we saw recently as well. So the question is, why such an emphasis on clothing? Does clothing really matter? To look at it from the opposite extreme, and to take from what the Torah looks at it for clothing, this week's Torah reading, the first chapter, second chapter, all talks about a chapter, about 43 verses, that goes in at length and discusses about the clothing that the high priest and the Kohanim and the Kohen Gadol, the high priest and the priest, would wear in the Holy Temple. We're talking about 43 verses. The creation of the world, in contrast, is only 31 verses. The Ten Commandments is only 14 verses. And over here, the Torah goes into detail to tell us what was the garments made out of: gold, silver, wool, purple wool, blue wool, all the different types of garments and how it was made, and the details into the stitching and what was on it and how it should be done. Why? What's so important about what they were wearing? Why does the Torah have to tell me and get into the nitty-gritty of the exact type of clothing and the tapestry of what the clothing that the Kohen Gadol and the Kohen would wear? Even more so if we look historically, our sages tell us, as we're soon going to see in detail, that there were many people throughout history who tried to get their hands on these clothing of the high priest, all the way as we're coming up to the story of Purim. Achashverosh was wearing it by his feast. Esav, Yaakov, Adam, Noah, Abraham. What's so unique and what's so special about these garments? And especially as we're going to see, there's also an idea that we know that people put on, as we come, Purim is coming up, costumes, that people change their garments. Where does that come in? What's going on over here? Did Achashverosh want to be a high priest? Did Adam, Jacob, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Esav, what were they wanting the garments of the high priest? And we're going to learn about today, as we mentioned in the beginning, as we're going to see that clothing, what you wear, matters. That as we're going to explain and expound on our discussion today, we're going to come to understand and appreciate the importance that clothing comes in a person's life, what it really symbolizes, and why God goes into such detail in discussing the garments of the high priest. And the lesson, of course, it teaches to us that we all have clothing that we wear, physical clothing as well as mental and emotional clothing, and how all of them are so important. And that's why you'll notice that in Judaism there is a great emphasis on clothing, whether it's a yarmulke for men, or whether it's the appropriate garbs that men and women should dress in appropriate and according to modesty. All these things have an important role and place in Judaism, as we're going to explain. So let's just take it from a simplistic perspective, just talking about what clothing does to the human being. I remember there was a talk that once the Rebbe explained to one of the CEOs of a hospital, CMOs of a hospital, and saying that how beneficial it would be for patients that as soon as they can to change out of the hospital garments into their own personal garments. And I've seen it myself personally. You can see people who, the moment they change, or if they're wearing their own clothing, even in the hospital setting, their mood is just completely different. There was somebody that used to come here. Whenever she would go, I saw her multiple times in the hospital, and she would always make sure to bring her own clothing to the hospital. And she would wear it, whether it was a certain time, and every time you walked in, she had a smile. One time she wasn't able to, and she had this depressed, despondent mood on her. And you see that clothing really does make a difference. It puts you in that certain attire, as we're going to get to. There was a woman in Crown Heights, originally from Russia, lived through communism. She was the mother of one of my teachers. Her name was Taiba Lipsker. She had about 9 children, running out of communist Russia, coming then to Toronto, coming then to America. Life was tough, living through communism, then finally coming to America and finding a living. Her husband had a hard time making a living, going from one job to another job because of the observance of Shabbos and so on. And it got to her, and she was emotionally down because of it, and very despondent. And she came to the Rebbe asking for advice. What should she do? Over here, she has to take care of her children. She wants to be there for her family, but at the same time, because of the turmoil that she's gone through and what she continues to go through, it is very difficult, and she feels very despondent. And the Rebbe told her something very unique. And he said, every single day, every other day, there's weddings, many weddings always happening in Crown Heights. Go to the weddings and dance, put on a nice dress, and go dance by the weddings. And that's what she did. And she would go to weddings. She was a known figure by all the weddings, whether she knew the person, didn't know the people, whether there was a wedding that there was almost nobody there and she was the one that was doing all the energy, and she was an older woman into her old age. She would go to every single wedding, and that's what gave her life and that's what gave her energy. At 94 years old, her grandson was getting married. One of the youngest children to her youngest son, Shmuel Lipsker, was getting married. And right before the chuppah, they heard that she wasn't feeling well, and they rushed her to the hospital. And as they rushed her to the hospital, you can imagine at that point, all her children went to the hospital as well with her. And the nurses look around and say, what's going on over here? Is this a wedding? Why is everybody wearing wedding dresses? And they said, yes, it is a wedding. And how appropriate it was for her that her last breath in this world was when everybody was wearing wedding dresses around her. That's what she lived her life for, and that's what gave her energy of life. So we'll talk about this idea that the clothing that a person wears is what gives the person some type of attitude and meaning to who they are, by looking at the discussion in this week's Torah reading. This week's Torah reading, Parshas Tetzaveh, as we mentioned, the Torah continues to tell us about the instructions of the building of the tabernacle and its vessels, and the different details of its structure was last week, and we spoke about the details and the importance of why the need for a structure that God can rest in. And this week the Torah continues to tell us about the garments that were made in the Holy Temple. Just an interesting side tidbit. This is the only Torah reading in the Torah ever since Moshe's birth that Moshe's name is not mentioned. It is the week that Moshe's passing. This week on Friday is the yahrzeit of Moshe's passing. One of the reasons why Haman decided to make the plot against the Jews in the month of Adar was because he said, this is a terrible month for the Jews, Moses died. Little did he know that Moses was also born on the same exact day. So it was also a good month for the Jews. But that's a separate class and discussion on its own. But in the Torah reading, Moshe's name is not mentioned. It is directed, it begins, ve'ata, you. It is the most direct to Moses. However, its name is not mentioned. And what is the Torah reading about? Most of it is about the garments that the high priest and the priest would wear in the Holy Temple. And it tells us about the different items that were used. Generally, there are 2 types of garments. There were garments that were restricted for the high priest, which were 8 garments, 4 of them which were made out of linen and all the different materials there, and different dyed materials. One of them had actually wool, the sash, and then there were another 4 of them that had gold in it as well. The priest them on their own would only wear 4 garments, and those garments were only made of linen and wool as well. What was the purpose of these garments? So as we see in this week's Torah reading, all the different garments, they were a hat, an apron, a sash, pants, a shirt, a tunic, and all these, and the high priest had the breastplate, and then the other apron with the stones on it as well. What was the purpose of these garments? The Torah tells us, in the words of the Torah, l'chavod u'litaferet, for honor and for beauty. Nachmanides expounds on this and explains this concept as follows: that the way a king dresses, the being that kings dress royalty, a king has a special crown, has a special robe, has a special everything, a special attire. So too God wanted that the priests and the high priest should be treated as royalty, should be treated with respect and dignity, and therefore they made these garments were to mimic, so to speak, the kings and the royalty that was there, so that the Jewish peoples have that royal expression as well for the Jewish people as well. And that's why you look, there was a hat, which is symbolic of a crown. You had a headband, which was also for their crown. And then you also had their robes, and all the different parts that they were wearing were there to be able to bring honor, dignity, royalty to the Kohanim and to the priests. However, while this is a very nice explanation of why the garments were necessary, why then does the Torah have to go into a long descriptive explanation of exactly the detail of how the garments were made? Let Bezalel, who we explained last week was a genius in his own right and he knew how to construct a tabernacle, look to what the kings around them were wearing and make something similar. The Torah could have said, you know what, dress them in royalty, and we would figure out what royalty means, to like everybody else's royalty. But the Torah finds a need, as we mentioned, in 43 verses to go through and in detail to tell us exactly what it should be. Why such detail, and why the garments the way where they were. The Kabbalists explain that, as we mentioned, there were different types of garments. There were 4 that were made out of linen and wool, and 4 that were made out of gold. And they explained that the 4 that were made out of the linen and the wool symbolized the idea of chesed, which is kindness, God's gratitude and generosity with the Jewish people. The Kohen who was there stemmed from the idea that they brought love. Aaron was a symbol of love and peace amongst the Jewish people. And therefore the Kohen's attitude and ability was to pray for the Jewish people in the Holy Temple and to bring God's generosity. At the same time, the gold symbolized discipline. That whatever God is giving to the Jewish people, that type of generosity, there's also a level of discipline, strength. That's why on Yom Kippur, when the Kohen Gadol, when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, he did not wear his gold clothing because he was bringing only generosity to the Jewish people. On a day of judgment, he did not want to bring any more discipline or any more scrutiny to the Jewish people. So the idea the Kabbalists explain, that what we have over here is that when a person wears the garments, when the Kohen was wearing the garments on while he was serving in the Holy Temple, they were there. The whole idea of what the Kohen is doing in the Holy Temple is to atone for the sins of the Jewish people, bringing the sacrifices and bringing God's glory and generosity by the Jewish people. Wearing the garments is another method to achieve and to symbolize and to bring God's generosity by the Jewish people. So that's what we have according to the Kabbalists. The commentaries on the Zohar explain this, as we mentioned, for that reason, as it comes to Yom Kippur. 1 second. Wasn't it heavy? It was what it was. I'm saying, well, not necessarily. They wove it in a certain way, but that was the job that the Kohen had to wear. The question is, why these clothing? How did these clothing reach that honor, that because of these clothing they were considered of something of honor and dignity, and because of that they symbolize royalty, they symbolize something of generosity that we talk about, chesed and gvura, in Kabbalistic ways? Seemingly it's only a garment. It's only a piece of clothing. Why are we giving so much credit to a piece of clothing, to a piece of material? Even more so, the Torah tells us that who are you making these garments for? You're making these garments for the Kohen that he has. You're making the clothing of the Kohen for the Kohen. What does that mean? So the rabbis learn and explore from this verse that a Kohen has to wear these garments when he's working in the Holy Temple. A Kohen who does not wear the garments while serving in the Holy Temple is liable of capital punishment. And he's only allowed to wear these garments in the Holy Temple. He's not allowed to wear the garments out of the Holy Temple. He's only allowed to wear them in the Holy Temple. And the question is, 1 second, what does it mean? If I don't wear my garments, I'm not a Kohen anymore. What makes me a Kohen? A Kohen is a genetic thing. If my father's a Kohen, I'm a Kohen. It doesn't make a difference if I wear garments or not. I'm still a Kohen. Why does the Talmud say a Kohen who doesn't wear the garments is not a Kohen? What do you mean he's not a Kohen? How can that be?
Are they setting them apart?
They were set, yes, they had to set them apart. They were unique. But what is it that we're talking about in this clothing and these garments that all of a sudden we're saying, this is what makes you a Kohen? Seemingly it's only clothing. You're telling me a king who doesn't wear his royal crown is not a king? A king who doesn't wear his royal robe is not a king? Even without the clothing, you're still considered a king. What does this mean to us? Even more so, something very unique you talk about at clothing. Who came up with the idea of clothing? Who was the first one to make clothing? God. You look around, everything else, all the other creatures in the world that God created, they don't need clothing. Animals don't have clothing. Vegetation doesn't have clothing. Even the clothing that God made, look at this interesting thing. When the sin of the tree of knowledge happened, all of a sudden Adam and Eve look at each other and say, oh no, we're naked. And what do? They cover their private spots. God comes along and makes them garments of leather, it says. And he clothed them. The word is vayalbishem, and he put clothes on them. That means besides for the fact that they already covered their private places, God gave them extra clothing that they should be covered, that they should be comfortable. That means who is the idea? Who came up with the idea of wearing clothing? God. The human being just felt, because of the sin of the tree of knowledge, that they have to cover up some spots. However, God came along and says, you need more than that. And I'm going to give you something that gives you clothing. And God clothed him. What is this telling us here? The Medrash takes it a step further. And the Medrash says something very interesting. Based on the translation, as we also see it in the Aramaic translation, when it says that God gave them clothing of dignity. The Medrash says something fascinating. Adam, when he brought sacrifices, we see when Adam came out of the Garden of Eden, he decided to bring sacrifices to God. And when he brought sacrifices, he wore the special clothing that was like the high priest's clothing, the garments of the high priest. Then he gave those garments to Seth, his son. Seth then gave those over to Methuselah, which is the grandfather of Noah. Methuselah gave Methuselah. Methuselah gave those over to Noah. And when Noah brought sacrifices after the flood, and he came out of the ark, he wore those garments as well. Noah gave those over to his oldest son, Shem. As we see in the Torah, it says that there was a fellow by the name of Malki Tzedek, that when Abraham came back from waging war against the people of the 5 kings, Malki Tzedek, who was the priest, it says this, the words in the Torah, he was the priest, came out and greeted him with gifts. Why was he called the priest? Because he was wearing those garments. He gave those garments to Abraham. When Abraham brought the sacrifices and brought the ram instead of his son Isaac, he wore those garments. He gave those garments to his son Yitzchak. Yitzchak gave those garments to his son Esau. When Esau all of a sudden comes home one day hungry, and Yaakov is cooking up lentil soup, and what does Yaakov tell him? Sell me the right of the firstborn. What was he asking him for? Because who would bring the sacrifices initially? Who were the Kohanim initially before Aaron was appointed to be this Kohen? The firstborn. When Yaakov was asking him, sell me the right of the firstborn, he was telling me, sell me the clothing that you got from Dad, the Kohen Gadol's garments. Esau says, what do I need it for? I'm never going to use it anyways. I'm not going to be in the Holy Temple. Here, take them. And he gave him those garments. Yaakov got those garments from Adam, from Isaac, from Abraham, from Methuselah, from Seth, from Adam, and that's how those garments were passed on. So what do we see from here? From day one of creation, from Adam all the way down to Esau, people had a desire to get their hands on those special garments of the high priest. What was so great about them? It's only made out of linen and gold. What's so unique about them? It's garments.
Yeah, but I don't think it's what it's made of.
So let's find out.
It represents
Okay. So let's go a step further. But what does it mean? How can clothing represent something? And that's what we're going to talk about. Even more so, who else wanted to wear these clothing? Achashverosh. And we're soon coming up to Purim. Next Friday is Purim. And what do we see by the story of Purim? How did the story of Purim start? Achashverosh, after Koresh, Cyrus, not letting the Jewish people move to the Holy Temple. First he said they could go, then he saw that he was losing tax money, so he said, that's it, you can't go up to the Holy Temple. Achashverosh saw that the Babylonian exile is extending. He was very excited about it. He threw a party. He thought that from now on the Jewish people are never going to return to the land of Israel. He's going to be the king forever on the universe. He threw a party of 180 days and invited all the Jewish people to come. The Talmud tells us that every single day of the party, why was Mordechai against the Jewish people attending this party, even though there was kosher food there? Because every single day at the party, Achashverosh would bring out more vessels from the Holy Temple showing, look, you guys are not returning, look what I got, look what we have from Nebuchadnezzar when he took from the Holy Temple. And then at the time he put on the garments of the high priest, he wore it at the party. A disgrace in showing discredit. Or why was he wearing that garments? Why did Achashverosh want to wear the garments of the high priest? Just to show that it's, to be able to desecrate it? That he can throw it on the floor and tear it. But he wore it. Why did he want to wear it? What was he showing over here? And we see in many different commentaries on the Megillah, in different places, alluding to the fact that he was wearing those 8 garments of the high priest. If you look in the Megillah, the word chur has a big ches, telling us the 8 garments of the Kohen Gadol of the high priest, Achashverosh was wearing. Why? What did he like about it? So we see again many different people trying to wear these garments of the Kohen Gadol. There must be something symbolic behind it that they wanted to wear. The Kli Yakar, a 16th century scholar, commentary on the Torah, gives us another story about the garments of the Kohen Gadol. Tells us about a story that's brought in the Talmud in the Tractate of Shabbos, page 31a, about a convert who was walking by a cheder of Jewish children studying Torah. And they were learning this week's Torah reading, the Torah reading of Parshas Tetzaveh, where he's describing to the children the magnificent, beautiful garments of the high priest. And the convert says, wow, I want to get to wear those clothing. Such beautiful clothing. I want to convert to Judaism so I can wear the clothing of the Kohen Gadol. He walks into the synagogue of Shammai, who was the leading teacher of the time, and he tells Shammai, I want to become a high priest. I want to convert to Judaism to become a high priest so I can wear the garments of the Kohen Gadol. As we know already, Shammai was not a person with much patience. And he looked at him and said, first of all, a convert can't become a Kohen. Your father has to be a Kohen to be a Kohen. And if you only want to convert to wear the garments of the Kohen Gadol, you don't belong here, you're not interested in Judaism, and take a hike. And kicked him out. So, Shammai didn't accept him. What did he do? He went to the next leading sage of his time, who was Hillel. He walks into Hillel's study hall and says, Hillel, I want to be a high priest and wear the garments of the high priest so I want to convert to Judaism. Hillel tells him, if you want to wear the garment of the high priest and you want to convert to Judaism, you have to learn everything a Kohen has to do. You want to be a high priest? You know what? Open up the book of Leviticus. You're going to have to be thorough in all the words of sacrifices, laws that a Kohen has to do, from A to Z. You can't just wear the high priest clothing. You got to know what you're doing. So he sat down and learned. And after he learned, he realized, while he's learning, he says, a stranger, meaning a non-Kohen, is not allowed to serve in the Holy Temple. All of a sudden, he says, oh my gosh, if I decide to wear these high priest garments, I'm going to die. And he went and he converted for the right reason. And he became a proper convert and recognizing that he's not going to wear high garments without wanting to wear the high garments. But again, the question is, what did the guy see? What did he hear about these beautiful garments that he says, I want to convert to Judaism because of it? What did he hear that all of a sudden got him so excited? What, he wants to wear a plate with gemstones? He wants to wear a robe with pomegranates? What did he see in it? What was he so excited? What was so fascinating about it that he's willing to convert to Judaism? And the Kli Yakar explains as follows. And he says, it wasn't that he wanted to convert, that he can be a high priest, to be able to wear the garments because he liked the beauty of the garments. But he was listening a little deeper in the class. And in the class, the teacher was explaining that when a Kohen Gadol wears the garments, what is the Kohen Gadol wearing the garments for? Because this is an atonement for the sins of the Jewish people. That by wearing the garments, this atones the sins of the Jewish people. And therefore he believed that if he were to wear these garments, he would be able to atone for his sins that he has gone through in all his life as being a non-Jew. And he says, I want to be able to live a life of purity, and how can I be able to attain such forgiveness? Is by me wearing the garments. Achashverosh, you want to say the same thing? Were those garments? Because he says, I was such a cruel person. I want to do whatever I want to do. What's my path to, so to speak, to least resistance? To be able to feel good about what I'm doing and also not feel any guilt is wearing the garments of the high priest, because then that will cleanse me from anything I do wrong. Not only that, Achashverosh himself believed himself to be a god of idolatry, he says by wearing these garments I can do both. I can feel like a godly and at the same time be atoned for it. Because if these garments carry such a virtue that by the Kohen Gadol wearing it, whoever wears it creates a level of forgiveness, then everybody would want to wear it. From here we see something very unique. Why did all these people want to wear the garments? Because they want to be able to have that level of achievement, that level of holiness and purity that the garments give the individual, that all of a sudden give them holiness. Where do we see this? Where do we see the importance of the garments? That the garments carry some type of weight, that they change the individual. This is especially found when it comes to many different things in life. Number one, when a person starts to pray, there's a mitzvah that when a person prays, to put on a special garment when you pray. It's called Hikin Likras Hashem Alekecha. To prepare before you come to a king. You put on something special, and that's why you'll see some people would put on a sash, a gartel it's called. Some people put on a jacket or a hat when they daven. To show they're putting on an extra garment, they're doing something extra as they're standing in front of the king. They're doing it by putting on a garment. Yes?
Just talking, it sounds like to me, he. What about women?
Oh, as well, we're going to get there in a moment. Okay. Same thing is on Shabbos, as we're soon going to hear. On Shabbos, men and women have an obligation, according to Jewish law, that we wear something special that we don't wear during the week, we wear on Shabbos. And that's called Shabbos clothes. That means, besides for a person, whatever you wear during the year, they say the Alter Rebbe, when he came to Mizrich, and which was his teacher, was there for many years, but he only came with one shirt. That's all he had, was one shirt. And every single Shabbos, he would make sure on Friday to take that shirt and wash it in the river, so he should have a clean shirt, a beautiful shirt for Shabbos. When the Alter Rebbe was in prison, and they had to give him prison clothes, they didn't let him wear whatever he wanted. So he tied a certain, handkerchief on the bottom of his garment to show that this was special for Shabbos. That means wherever a person is, no matter what they have, they should try to show that their garment, this is unique. This garment they only wear for Shabbos. Whether men or women. The same idea is also that women and men, we have the laws of modesty. To be able to be dressed, and it doesn't make a difference we're out in public or whether we're in our own home. We walk around with clothing that we should be modest and we should recognize who we are. Clothing tells us who we are, and therefore when a person prays, they also prepare themselves properly to make sure that when they're praying, women and men, to make sure they're modest when they're praying. Because a person standing in front of a king, a person has to put on a level to, as we're soon going to see what the clothing does. But the actual clothing we do find in Judaism, clothing makes something with an individual, changes that personality. We see it as well when we talk about the same idea. When coming up to Purim, there's an interesting custom that's brought out in Jewish law. The custom was that people used to put on costumes, change their clothing. Why do people put on costumes? So this custom of wearing a costume is already brought down from the 16th century Rav Moshe Sorelish, when he was a scholar. He was the one that wrote the Ashkenazic footnotes on the Jewish law, on coded Jewish law. And it says that when he was that he used to go around on Purim dressed up, and at the end of Purim knocking everybody's doors, reminding them that they should do evening service, because people may be a little drunk and tipsy, they would forget to do it. So he would remind them all, but he would say that he would go around dressed up like a poor person, reminding everybody to do the evening prayer. So we see the idea of costumes. Why did they get costumes? Because what is the concept of a costume? We already see who was the first one to make a costume, to get dressed up, was Jacob. Who was Jacob making a costume for? To be able to get the blessings that Esau had. Esau was the grandfather of Amalek. The grandfather of Amalek, Amalek is the grandfather of Haman. So we see that already the Jewish people have been costumes avoiding Amalek already from day one. But why did Rivka want him to get dressed up? So there's one of the Hasidic commentators explain as follows. Says because who was Esau on the front? It looked like a bad guy. Jacob looked like a good guy. What was Rivka saying? That even a Jew who may on the outside be dressed up as a bad guy, really on the inside is a pure Jewish soul. He's a Jacob. And that's what we see that the Jewish people, by the story of Purim, They may be on the outside, they were dressed up, they went to the story, they went and enjoyed Achashverosh's meal. But internally, they were so connected to the Judaism that when the story turns around, they were able to reach a level even greater than the time of the giving of the Torah, and that's how unique the Jewish people were. So the concept of getting dressed up is recognizing that even though we may be having imposter syndrome, thinking that we're somebody else, but really deep down we all have that pintali yid, we have that godly soul that's always connected. But that's just a little side note, talking about dressed up. But what we see very clearly is the idea of getting dressed up, that the concept of wearing a garment and your clothing makes who you are. People look at you different who your clothing is. They say a story about Ben Gurion. He was once going to a meeting in Israel, and he was going in his usual attire, short sleeve shirt, this shirt half open with all his hair coming out and everything else. And one of his generals told him, "You're going to an ambassador's meeting, you should maybe put something on." So he says, "You know what? Winston Churchill told me I can go like this." They look at him and says, "What? Winston Churchill told you can go like this?" He says, "Yeah. When I was in England and I was going to a meeting dressed like this, Churchill told me in Israel you go like this, not here." He said, "In Israel you go like this, but not here." So he says, Winston Churchill. But they say about an Israeli guy was once going to America for a high-tech meeting. So, he asked his friends, "How do I meet the Americans? What should I do?" They told him, "When you go to the meeting, make sure you put on a jacket." So he says, "Okay." Israelis don't usually wear jackets. They go in their, short sleeves and wherever, in the sandals, wherever going to every meeting. So he puts on a jacket and he's there for a week straight. The meetings go wonderful. And at the end, the head investor, the hedge fund guy, comes over to him and says, "It's great that you came here with a jacket, but next time, don't wear the same jacket for a week straight." What we see from over here is that garments, and simply put, a garment is a method and a medium for a person to give over an image. A garment is what people look at you. Your first impression on a person is the way they dress. You see a person's dressing in nice, fancy, brand name clothing. What's your first assumption? That they're doing pretty well for themselves. A guy comes dressed like a shmata, you think he's a homeless. Your first impression is that you look at the person and automatically you can tell what the person is. You see a person walks into a meeting in his jogging clothes, whatever, you say the guy's not interested in serious business. But if he comes in a tie, in a suit, and well pressed, you say the guy's interested in business. What simply meaning, when we look back at the words that the Torah says, why the high priest should have special garments, is in the words of the Torah, lekaved ulisifares, for beauty and for splendor, for honor and for splendor. You want that the Jewish people should respect the Kohen. You want that the Jewish people should know who the Kohen is. And therefore, the first impression of the Kohen should be, you're looking at this person, grandeur, unbelievable, royalty, they're serving in the Holy Temple. They don't look like a regular Joe Schmo on the street. That's what number one impression is. For that reason, we find in the Torah, and in the Talmud, and in the Code of Jewish law, the garments of a person are called their honor. Rabbi Yochanan, it says, used to call his garments the things that respect him. Meaning that because of that, his body is that means his body underneath it was protected. He looked good because of it. That's why they respected him. The prophet Isaiah talks about it as well, talking about the army of Sancherib, and that it would burn in fire, meaning their honor, their clothing, their uniforms. Code of Jewish law talks about it, as we mentioned before, when it comes to Shabbos, that a person should have beautiful garments for Shabbos. As well as it talks about in the prophets and in the verses, when a person should honor the Shabbos, means that a person should have a specific garment that they wear for Shabbos. The garments you wear for weekdays should not be the same garments you wear for Shabbos. When a person comes and they see him wearing clothing, they respect him, they see where his clothing is from, they see if it's dusty, they know how far he came, they see where he's doing, what he's about. Your garments tell you a lot about who the person is. Just an interesting story. I just heard a story just a few months ago from the person himself that it happened to. His name is Mendy Offen. He's now involved with Chabad in soldiers on the army bases. He goes every single day, in different days and holidays, bringing good spirit to the army, to the soldiers in the army base. And he's dedicated his life mission for the past 25 years to do this. How it all started was actually Purim in 2000. Him and his brother were in a jeep, army jeep. They were going to Hebron. Hebron is in the West Bank. They were going to visit the soldiers and bring them the good Purim cheer. It was about 7 Chabad boys in the jeep, in this truck that they had. and they were going from Hebron to they left the army base, and they were going to the place where, what do they call it? They have these junctures where the soldiers are standing, they close off the road, and the soldiers are standing there to a place called Turkamia. And as they're getting there, they're about, I would say, half a mile away from the cross point, where the soldiers are. All of a sudden, they were ambushed by a bunch of Arabs. And they were shooting at the car. The guy put the pedal to the metal, and he just made it quickly, and he came to the place where all the soldiers are. But meanwhile, people were shot, and this fellow, Mendy Ofen, his brother Shmulik, who was sitting next to him, was shot and was bleeding. They tried putting a tourniquet on him and whatever it could be, and they're trying to stop the bleeding. Thankfully, they got there, ambulance came, they put him in the ambulance, but to get from where they were to an ambulance in Jerusalem was a good 30-minute drive. And they got to stop the bleeding, and they got to take care of the bullet that he got wounded. All of a sudden, while the ambulance is on its way to Jerusalem, they start seeing big flares, big lights from on top. A helicopter lands in front of them, an army helicopter, comes, takes the patient out of the ambulance, and brings the patient, Shmulik Ofen, to the hospital. And thank God, the next day in the morning, already Purim morning, he woke up, and he was able to put on tefillin, and he's super duper recovered. They asked afterwards what happened all of a sudden that a helicopter came to bring a chopper, came and all of a sudden took the kid to the hospital. They were going in the ambulance. What happened was, on the way, in the Jeep, Shmulik, the brother, was getting cold. And he asked his brother Mendy for his jacket. Now Mendy Ofen, every single year when he used to go to the army base, he would get dressed up like a general of Tzahal. He would wear the uniform, the top shirt of a uniform of Tzahal guy. So that's what he was wearing. He was wearing the jacket with the medals. It was a fake uniform. It was a costume of a Tzahal uniform. He gave it to his brother because his brother was cold. One of the people that by the army base saw a uniform of a general, he radioed in and said a general is wounded. So they sent the helicopter, and that's what saved his life. So you see, it's what you wear is what saved his life. Talking about what you wear, and they say another story, just a cute story, talking about garments and what you wear. There was once a woman who came to the Rogatchover Goin. The Rogatchover was a great rabbi in the city of Dvinsk, lived about 150 years ago. And she came to him and she said she was all concerned, and she said she doesn't know what to do. Every Shabbos, her baby doesn't want a nurse. A whole week it's fine. But Shabbos, the baby doesn't want a nurse. So the great scholar of the Rogatchover would use very few words to be able to answer his questions. And he answers and says, it's a clear problem that's mentioned in the Jerusalem Talmud, and went back to learning. She didn't know what he was talking about. So she goes to the rabbi, the other rabbi, the Lithuanian rabbi of the city, Rab Meir Simcha, the Or Sameach, and she says, maybe you can explain to me what the Rogatchover Goin is talking about. And he thinks about it and says, yes, this is what he's referring to. There's a commentary in the Talmud, in Baba Kama, that says as follows. A goring animal, an animal that gores, on Shabbos is not considered a goring animal during the weekday. That means there's a law that we learned about it a few weeks ago in the book of Exodus, that if somebody has a goring animal, once it does once or twice, it's considered a goring animal, and you're liable, and you have to make sure you kill the animal. Over here, the commentary says, if it only gores on Shabbos, then it's not considered a goring animal, and you don't have the same liability. The question is why? And the explanation is because during the week, the animal's used to people wearing a certain type of attire. On Shabbos, you're dressed in a different attire. So the animal gets all confused. And because it gets all confused, it will start goring. Same thing he was telling this mother. The baby recognizes you all week. On Shabbos, you're changing your clothing. So therefore, the baby doesn't recognize you and doesn't want a nurse from you. And that's what was happening. He says, wear the clothing, wear the shirt that you wear during the week, and the baby will want a nurse from you. And that's what happened. So you see over here the idea that clothing, how much it has to do. Going back to the ideas of modesty as well. And we see one of the things today, unfortunately, with the provocative generation that we live in, the more a person doesn't wear, the more they become famous. And unfortunately, we've seen it. And the Rebbe once spoke about this idea of modesty that we see that Judaism teaches us that we have to cover up. Why? Because we believe that you have more to you than just your body. That means you're more of a person that people should look at you not because you can sell them a piece of flesh, you're not on a meat market, but because you have intellectual, you have emotional, you have kindness, you have different things that you are, that a person has. The human being is not an animal. An animal, you look at how big it is and how fat it is and be able to use it, to be able to enjoy it, to be able to eat from it, or to be able to use its milk. An animal is on the meat market. People are not a meat market. But unfortunately, what did the society create? We made human beings, we made them into a meat market, and the less a person wears, that's what they sell themselves as. And that's what we're celebrating, the less what they wear. On the contrary, Judaism teaches us that why do we have to cover up? To be able to show that the unique ability about a person is that the clothing represents what's inside of us. The very fact that people don't wear the clothing is because they have nothing inside of them, and therefore they don't have anything to show for themselves. When we wear clothing that is modest, that is representing who we are, what we stand for, and the values and teachings and morals and ethics that we have within inside of us, because clothing represent who we are, what we do, and how we can represent ourselves. This is what we see this clearly. The Sefer HaChinuch, the one who explains and codifies many of the mitzvahs, says as follows. And he explains a deeper rationale when we talk about the garments that the Kohen Gadol wore. He says that the Kohen Gadol and the Kohen were a messenger of the Jewish people. They are standing in the Holy Temple bringing the sacrifices. And when they're standing in the Holy Temple bringing the sacrifices, they have to be there to represent the Jewish people and make sure that the Jewish people's sacrifices are accepted on high. They have to be in the proper mode to be able to give those on high. They can't be in a way of, just all over the place. What gives them the ability to bring together and to be in the right, proper position to bring those sacrifices and to ask for forgiveness on high is when they're wearing their clothing. Their clothing create a certain type of modality, a certain type of ethics, a certain type of virtue, a level of discipline that gives them the ability to concentrate on what they're doing and to be able to bring about the holiness to the Jewish people, what that is needed. That means clothing inspires the individual, gives the individual a purpose, a reason, a rationale, and gives them perspective of what they're doing. For that reason, we find that the Torah is so particular that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, changes his clothing when it comes Yom Kippur and he walks into the Holy of Holies. Because he has to have white. We all see white, we right away see purity. You ever see a bride, all of a sudden you say the bride looks beautiful no matter what. Why? Because it's what she's wearing reflects on the person. When people wear a certain type of garment, it changes the atmosphere, the attitude, and the idea. It is for that reason that most businesses have dress codes. Schools have dress codes. Why is there dress codes? Because when people wear certain clothing, it tells you what kind of environment you want. On the contrary, when the business says today is dress down Friday, is because they want a casual, dress down type of environment. When they tell you to wear suits, it's because they want a certain level of discipline in their environment. So the clothing is what the actions is what determines the person's behavior. As we see this today, as it says in many, as the Sefer HaChinuch continues to say, after the actions of a person is what the heart is drawn to. The way we behave, the way we do things, all of a sudden that's what we'd feel. People feel certain things because they're dressed in a certain way, they will behave in a certain attitude. You walk into a place and everybody's dressed a certain way, you feel you have to behave a certain way as well. This is, they say a story actually about Martin Greenfield. Ever heard of Martin Greenfield? He was a guy, he was a big tailor, brand name tailor, made many suits for presidents all the way going back to Herbert Hoover, I think. I don't know how far he went back. But he made many suits in downtown, in Lower East Side of Manhattan. Martin Greenfield's clothing, very famous. He made for many of the presidents and all the fancy stars, celebrities, all their clothing. He was very influential that he was able to talk to these people when he saw them, so to speak, as a tailor. For example, in 1956, right after Israel was a new country at the time, he was making a suit for President Eisenhower, and he put 5 little notes in the suit that Eisenhower should see it. And basically what he told him is, if you take out your foreign minister, John Poster, then the war would be over, send him on vacation, and everything would work out, and the American won't get hurt, because he was the one in the Suez Canal over there making problems. So they say a story, how did Martin Greenfield get into suits? How did he get into the textile business, into being a tailor? So he was in the Holocaust. He was born in Czechoslovakia. At 16 years old, he was in Auschwitz. But because he was a pretty built fellow, he was only 16, even though he wasn't 18, They thought he was older, and they sent him to the labor camps. In the labor camps, his job was, he was in the washing the clothes, washing the uniforms of the Gestapo, of the SS fellows. He was one time cleaning a uniform from one of the SS officers, and because he was brushing it too hard, it ripped. When the SS officer came and saw it, we got all angry at him, beat him up, of course, and then threw the suit and says, who needs this ripped suit? And just threw it at him and says, what are you worth? Him looking at the suit says, 1 second. I just got a blessing in disguise. It's freezing cold. He took this old suit, put it under his uniform from the concentration camp, and this way he was kept warm. But he noticed something very interesting. Because he was wearing this collar of the commanding officer, he all of a sudden wasn't walking bent, he started walking straight. And everybody around him was giving him respect because they saw the collar. He said, wow, this is what clothing does to you. Clothing changes the humanity of a person. And from that moment he made up, he's going to get it back afterwards, and he's going to go into the clothing business. And that's what he carried with him all along. But we see over here, again, the whole idea is that when we're talking about clothing, that the Kohen's clothing is what makes who the Kohen was. And that's why when we go back to our original question, why a Kohen who doesn't wear his clothing is no longer can serve in the Holy Temple and is liable of capital punishment. Why? Just because he's not wearing his clothing is not a Kohen? Yes. It makes you a Kohen and gives you the ability and the fortitude and the frame of mind to be able to connect and give that ability to the... Okay, we're back on. Sorry about that. So, just because, therefore, we're telling the Kohen, yes, you need to wear garments because that's going to give you the ability to be in the moment and to be there for the Jewish person that you're bringing the sacrifice for. You have to be able to get to that level. The clothing is what create your connection and give you the ability to be in that frame of mind. With this we can understand now why all the great people, Adam, Chase, and Methuselah, Noah, Avram, Yitzchak, Esav, Yaakov, why did they want to wear the garments of the high priest? Because they wanted to be in that frame of mind. They wanted to be in the level of the high priest's frame of mind when he's standing in front of the Jewish people, bringing that generosity and discipline to the Jewish people. They were able to take all that energy and understand to be able to transform it. Even a person like Achashverosh, who looked himself as a deity, he looked himself as a deity, he looked himself as an idol, he runs the world. But he wanted to wear those garments of the Kohen Gadol so he can go even higher. Looking at the garments to bring them to a level that even more than before. With this we can also understand the importance of why modesty is so important in Judaism. Modesty even in a place where nobody sees you. Even when you're in your own bedroom to be able to be dressed. Why? Because modesty is teaching us that wherever you are, you're reminding yourself that God is there. That it's a place of God's existence. Wherever you are, in every single place, because a person, when they're not dressed, lack of dress is what causes a person to do the most disgusting things that exist. A person who has, what it is every single person has within himself the ability to choose good or bad. Within us we have an evil inclination and a godly inclination. Clothing gives us the ability to cover up on our evil inclination, suppresses the evil inclination. And when a person is covered, a person is basically saying, I'm able to cover up and only reveal the godly soul within myself. On the other end, when a person needs to reveal everything they have, what they're also doing is revealing the evil inclination within themselves, and therefore it propels them and leads them to things which are not good. And that's why we can see many people, when they're not dressed appropriately, or different things, automatically we see where it leads and what it causes. And over here we see very clearly the importance of clothing in every single way and the impact it makes on the person. But there's another set of clothing. The other set of clothing is not only the clothing, the external clothing, which is important, but there's also internal clothing, garments of our soul. The Alter Rebbe in the 4th chapter of Tanya explains that the soul has 3 garments: thought, speech, and action. The thoughts are the most internal, the speech are external for another person, and action is what we do and how it impacts us even after it leaves us. But why does the Alter Rebbe call it clothing? Garments. They are garments of the soul. They express our insights. The same way physical clothing tells you about the person who's wearing it, so too our thought, speech, and action tell us about our soul. But even more so, just like a physical garment, today I can put it on and I can take it off and I can change it. If I don't like this sweater, I can put on another sweater. If I don't like this shirt, I can put on another shirt. So too, My thoughts and speech and actions don't determine who I am. I can change them. If they're not good, I can put on different ones. They're all my choice. I make a choice what to wear or not to wear. I make a choice what I should be wearing or I shouldn't be wearing. And the same way the things that I wear or don't wear make an impact on what people see as me and the way I behave, not only what other people observe, but more importantly, way I behave, because when I'm wearing clothing in a certain setting, I behave a certain way. When I'm not wearing clothing or the lack of clothing create me to behave in a certain way, so too the thought, speech, and action of the human being create that environment of the human being, create the mindset of the person. And the same way our thoughts, for example, that's why it's so important when we talk about think good will be good. When we put ourselves in a positive mindset, we attract positivity. When we put ourselves and talk about negativity, we attract negativity. By talking about good, by thinking about good, and by doing good, that's the best thing that a person can do for their soul. The person feels good. So if we want to feel good, and we want to be able to do good, and we want to feel good about ourselves, what would be the best thing is to be able to be around positive things. Finish off with one cute story. Mrs. Weiss, her name was. She was getting married, and before their marriage, it was a custom that the bride and groom would go into the Rebbe for a private audience. She goes in with her husband. This is the week before the wedding, when they're still, the custom is in that for a week before the wedding, the week before the wedding, they can still see each other, bride and groom, but then they don't see each other for 7 days until after the chuppah. Right before while they're still allowed to see each other, they go into the Rebbe's room for a private audience. The Rebbe gives them the blessings for their upcoming wedding, and then she asks the Rebbe, can I ask the Rebbe something in private without my groom, without my chassan, without my fiancé here? And the Rebbe says, sure. So he asks the fiancé to leave the room. They leave the room, and she talks to the Rebbe. After she walks out of the room, they both each go their own way. They don't see each other for another 7 days. After the chuppah, they come, they see each other, and her husband asks his wife, can I ask you a question? What did you want to speak to the Rebbe about in private there? We never had a chance to talk about it. And she tells him as follows. I told the Rebbe that I want to break off the wedding. I said, why? And she told the Rebbe that I'm a very person who's very tense. I get angry quickly. I don't have patience. And I'm afraid that the marriage is not going to last. And therefore, I don't want to go into something putting him in a bad position. I think I'm not the right person. The Rebbe was opposed to the fact that me breaking it off. He says, by divine providence that the two of you are together. It's something you have to continue. But after you get married, you're going to go get a job in either a daycare center to deal with kids, or in an old age home to be with old seniors, and you'll learn patience. And this way, by the time you have children, you'll be able to be a person with patience, and you'll be able to be a very good mother and a very good wife. And so she did. And that's what she did. And she went on to have, I think, 15 children, and they lived for 60 years married together, a wonderful, happy marriage. What was the idea the Rebbe was telling her here? We decide what our thoughts and actions and speech should be. We choose to be able to know what our garments are. We choose the clothes we wear or lack thereof. And we know that we are putting ourselves in positions that when we wear certain clothing, what that's going to bring us to do and behave in certain ways. The Torah goes on to extend itself in 43 verses about the garments of the Kohen Gadol, telling us that the garments of the Kohen Gadol made the Kohen Gadol the high priest who he was, so he should be able to be the representative of the Jewish people. So too, we are told to wear certain garments, whether it's for Shabbos putting on a special garment, or during the week to wear a specific garment, whether it's modesty or the garments of our soul, that our thought, speech, and action should be conducted in a certain manner, because that makes us who we are.